Good morning, everyone. This is Ashwin from the Global Alliance for Mass Entrepreneurship. Welcome to 60 Days, 60 Voices. This is GAME's initiative to really bring thought leaders, experts, organizations, and individuals working on the ground with entrepreneurs and helping them transition and see through this crisis. As everyone knows, we're part and kind of experiencing almost an unprecedented crisis. Small businesses are particularly hit. We hear notes around. We hear from the ground often about liquidity crunches. We hear demand having a precipitous drop. We often hear entrepreneurs unsure about the future and unable to predict what's going to happen to their businesses going forward. So we're trying to have these conversations to make sure that we as an ecosystem can respond together, learn from each other, and also understand what other people are doing so that we can, I think going forward, look at new kinds of partnerships, look at new kinds of collaborations that really help the small business ecosystem. To kick things off today, I wanted to introduce our guest, Medha. Medha is from the Pratham Institute. She's the co-head of their skill development and entrepreneurship initiative. Welcome, Medha, to 60 Days, 60 Voices.
Hi, Ashwin. Great to be here.
Excellent. So to kick things off, Medha, it'll be great to understand Pratham's work in the skill development and entrepreneurship space in particular, and then we can have a broader conversation about COVID.
Sure. So Pratham is primarily and has been known as an educational organization. I guess when you start working in education, you also end up starting to work with youth because you do realize larger problems of youth employment and so on. So our journey started about 12 years ago with working with youth when we were basically trying to train a bunch of volunteers to do our work for education. It started off as an initiative called Siksha ke Badle Siksha, or Education for Education, several years ago. And the demand was huge. What we were essentially doing is we were trying to train volunteers and give them skills in return for the work that they do in education. And we started basically training them in digital literacy, in financial literacy, in communication skills. This is the pre-Skill India era. And in about 2 years, we saw that 80,000 youth had enrolled and gotten trained, and there was a lot of enthusiasm around it. So that's how our journey into vocational training and working with youth started. We're now a full developed arm of the organization, which just works on skill development and entrepreneurship now. We typically do this through 130 vocational training residential centers that we run across 15 states in the country. The target audience that we work with is very rural, comes from tribal areas, typically first generation entrants into the formal sector economy, non-agrarian jobs. And so, of course, a large part of what we do is direct skill development, but a lot of it is also around cultural acclimatization and bridging the information asymmetry to be able to move youth into jobs that they've traditionally not had access to. So each year right now through these 130 vocational training centers, we train about 30,000 students who are placed in jobs. About 85% of them find job placements or at least take up job placements. A lot more are offered jobs. I think, again, skill development, like education, sometimes leads to working with youth. Working on vocational training invariably always leads to working on entrepreneurship as well. And so our journey to start working in entrepreneurship was incidental. We saw that even after we provided job placements to every single student who entered the vocational training program, we saw that about 5% of them right after the course ended would always become, whoever could, they would always sort of start their own enterprises. And there were some commonalities that we saw. We saw that a lot of women wanted to be entrepreneurs just because of the access of jobs within the confines of their areas. But we also saw a lot of people who had access to capital from families. They would sort of start their own enterprises. And we saw that over time, that graph would look very different. We would start off with about 5% of our students becoming self-employed entrepreneurs. And we saw that after a couple of years of experience, at the end of 2 years of completing the course, when they'd be in formal employment, about 18% of them would become entrepreneurs on their own.
And what kind of sectors are you focused on, or where do these entrepreneurs kind of focus themselves on organically? Is there kind of a bias that you have that you're working towards?
Sure. So I think for us, the sectors that we work in make it self-selective in terms of what the students become entrepreneurs in. The sectors that we work in are broadly of two kinds. One is service sector and the other is typical hands-on blue-collar jobs. So we train people to become in the service sector. We train them to become beauticians, to work in hospitality across a variety of sort of opportunities in food and beverage, food production, housekeeping. And we also train them in healthcare. So the entrepreneurs typically in those segments come from two spaces. One is beauticians and the other is food production, where people start their own enterprises, restaurants, dhabas, and different sort of ranges of kiosks. So in service sector, healthcare, of course, is a no-go. Nobody becomes an entrepreneur there. And in the blue-collar segment, we train people in all kinds of, again, jobs. These range from construction to electrical, plumbing, automotive, welding, and so on. And we see our students become entrepreneurs in all of those sort of diverse ranges of things. Again, varying between urban, peri-urban, and rural areas where they sort of set up their enterprises.
Got it. And one of the things that you were mentioning was that you're kind of collecting data from the ground and trying to understand what's happening during this crisis to entrepreneurs, as well as the students you've trained who are now placed in jobs. So could you talk a little bit about the sectors that you just spoke about, service sector, beauticians, construction, and so on, and what are some of the trends that you're seeing? What are some of the pain points that you're seeing coming from the ground?
Sure. So we're still in the process of sort of reaching out to, again, ranges of people. We're reaching out to we have 1 year on the ground, so we're reaching out to our communities, to students who've been working in these communities, some of whom have come back. And so just a large scale outreach to our alumni body, which is now over 100,000 students. And the other is sort of a year on the industry, and we're trying to speak to employers to see what sort of employment patterns will look like. I think big picture, we're seeing very similar experiences, right? So I can speak to two sectors at the other ends of the spectrum. So if you look at beauty as one sector, which is sort of single enterprise, single person led enterprise run by women traditionally. And the other would be, say, construction, which is a multi-people. You typically have in a construction enterprise, you have anywhere between 5 to 40, especially the range that we work in, 5 to 40 workers in an entrepreneurship in the institution. And it's typically men-run institutions in urban areas, which is very migratory, as opposed to beauticians who are close to their homes. In both these sectors, I think experiences are very, very uniform and similar. We've seen that for the business owners, of course, incomes have completely halted. In constructions, payments from their subcontractors, as you know, in construction, it's about 12 layers of subcontracting. And so most of the micro entrepreneurs who are the last mile right before the workers, we see haven't received their payments for the month of March as well. In construction, we've seen about 80% of them haven't. Similarly, in beauty, we've seen about 70% of people who've been employed in the industry haven't received their wages as well. So I guess the source of income has stopped for beauty as well. By the month of mid-March, all services had stopped. So they had like half a month of income. That then translates downwards, right? So March onwards, wages have stopped. For construction, we see migrant workers are stuck in all kinds of places with very little sort of access to be able to go home, to get essentials, to even send back money home. And it speaks to just the informality of just all the transactions that happen in these sectors. So migrant workers aren't able to send back money home. All of these sectors we see are very hand-to-mouth existence, right? And so people have very limited savings and survival for subsequent months. We heard of sort of major concerns around that. And in most of these cases, we've seen that there's no alternative source of income. In our survey, we're seeing about 96-95% of them claim to have no source of income. What they're relying on are small sustenance pieces of agricultural land that they'll go back to, or agricultural labor that they'll sort of engage in. But I think very similar concerns across board that we're seeing. We don't work in industries, of course, where there is a supply of products. And so the supply chain and consumer demand that's been hit across all other micro MSMEs is something that we have not personally seen, but we're sort of hearing from the ground as well.
Got it. I think trying to understand you hinted at coping mechanisms a little bit. You mentioned that, going back to villages and, using agriculture as a mechanism for supplementing incomes at this stage. Are you seeing other trends around kind of social security or, perhaps pivoting their own business model towards something else? Looking at some other avenues for income. Are there any other coping mechanisms that you have found from your conversations with these entrepreneurs?
Sure. So I'm glad you mentioned social security. I think in any conversation of MSMEs, I think it's most important, or just micro entrepreneurs, the segments we work with. I think two elements of highest importance are, one, the fact that data for all of these doesn't exist, which sort of just exacerbates all problems. And the other is just informal nature of not just business, but employment. And so just the fact that anybody who works in a micro enterprise or runs a micro enterprise doesn't have most documents that are required to prove that they run a business, right? And the fact that anybody who's working for them has no sort of social security benefits either. They have no written contract, and I think those numbers exist in public knowledge, right? That even according to the periodic labor force survey, we see 71% of them don't have written contracts, 54% have no paid leaves, 50% again have no social security benefits. So I think those are conservative estimates, but across board, lack of access to social entitlements is a big one. So the way we're looking at things right now is, in an immediate run, you can provide direct rations and support to people, but in the mid to long term, providing access to social entitlements is a very large part of it, even as governments and so on start rolling out additional benefits. And just right now, we're seeing, even with access to food, the lack of PDS, lack of Aadhaar cards, lack of ration cards is just being such a big hindrance to people accessing them. So I think a very large part of our work right now has to focus around getting people access to social entitlements, getting documentations made, just bridging the information asymmetry around what the benefits could be. That's one, I'd say. But automatic coping mechanisms and coping, I think, is happening across board. And people do always creatively try to see what they can do. With migrant labor, it's been very difficult. Most of them are stuck in urban areas or are sort of transiting back home. And there, I think, is very sort of nascent to say what those pivots would look like. But with a lot of our women entrepreneurs, we've seen them be really creative. We've seen women sort of pivot into moving from a non-essential service, as it's defined right now, to seeing how they can be involved in essential services. We're seeing women who've taken up large-scale contracts of mask manufacturing, interestingly. And again, there too, what we've been finding is it has been a question of information asymmetry. And we see that women who have smartphones, who are connected to their local markets, who are connected to, say, self-help groups who've been able to fill out tenders for these requirements, have sort of been able to access these more quickly. And others who don't have such accesses haven't been able to make those pivots in what's required. We're seeing a lot of them right now focusing on, say, upskilling, seeing what the industry will look like. We've seen actually a lot of our entrepreneurs, at least, and I know it's a very uniform microcosm of an experience, but we're seeing a lot of them sort of start their own video channels or join video channels to learn better skills. But I think the pivot right now has been to essential services. Some are making masks, some are figuring out how to make sanitizers, and everybody's figuring out what life post the lockdown looks like with social distancing norms. But I think too early to say what that looks like.
I think it's excellent to hear that folks are pivoting towards essential services, and that both the importance of exposure as well as organization and collectivization as a mechanism to access some of these things. Like filling out a tender, for example, is not just something that will be hard to do by yourself if you don't have the experience, but will be hard to fulfill if you're not collectivized as an individual micro entrepreneur. So that's excellent to hear. I wanted to just quickly talk about Pratham's own response and how you're thinking about you as an organization and your entrepreneurs, and how can you best support them. So would love to hear how you're thinking about this at Pratham Institute.
Sure. So I think it's being thought of in some of the parts that I've described of immediate access, immediate relief measures, which is nothing to do with entrepreneurship, just more of a humanitarian effort to ensure people are able to survive through this time before they tide through it economically as well. So a lot of focus has been on that end. I think phase two, what we're looking at right now, what we're also looking at is just information gathering. There's just such limited hard-backed data around just whether people are receiving wages, what are the specific difficulties that they're receiving. So as I mentioned, we have sort of two arms looking specifically at figuring out what the conditions on ground are. And I think a lot of the compilation of all of those findings will happen within this week. There have been very interesting reports that are coming out of other sectors as well around just entitlements and so on. But I think specific needs of micro entrepreneurs would be great to have. And that's what we're sort of focusing on right now. In terms of next steps, I think is similar. It is around figuring out how you can bridge some of these information gaps when you have learning from one end of our entrepreneurship spectrum of how they're pivoting. I think a lot of effort for us has been just creating better channels of connectivity between these entrepreneurs. For us, both in the construction sector and in beauty, these are typically people who don't have, they're all first generation entrepreneurs. They don't have people that they can rely on for what these coping mechanisms could look like. And we've seen that if you're able to connect them, bring them together and just create these information channels, a lot can happen just through that. So I think those are some of the pieces that we're right now focusing on. I think in the slightly mid to long term, what we're also right now thinking about is what's being spoken about broadly, which is once the lockdown opens up, a lot of sectors that we work in are dependent on people coming back into their workforce, which is in urban areas. In times that those don't happen, if people want to stay back home, I think the larger questions of whether micro entrepreneurs can be supported in rural areas and whether a rural economy will be able to sustain them. So I think those are some of the pieces that we're thinking about. But I think right now in the short term, it's very focused on tiding through the next month or so financially and getting those accesses.
No, that's I think that that framework of in the short term focus on survival, in the medium term and long term focus on opportunities, especially in rural areas, and then using kind of collectivization and information asymmetry as themes to be able to say, can we help entrepreneurs, understand what are opportunities out there both in the short and medium run, and then network and collectivize so that they can bridge some of those gaps around what are ways in which you realize these opportunities, right? Where can you find them? Where can you find a input manufacturer? Where can you find a market? Where can you find a financier, and so on and so forth? And really learning from other people's experiences. All of those resonate with us quite a bit. It's some of how GAME is also thinking about its response to COVID. And I think that's great to hear. Just to close the conversation, I think you've really laid out how Pratham is thinking about it and what challenges the entrepreneurs face. Would love to understand your call to action almost for partners, for the ecosystem. How should we all think about this crisis and really working? I think she dropped out. Pratham is trying to do and thinking about. Would love to understand what kind of collaborations are you looking for? What kind of partners would really help bolster the work of Pratham as you think about how do you support your entrepreneurs best? And any tips based on your own experiences and how Pratham is thinking about supporting small businesses on how the ecosystem should think about this problem and this crisis?
Sure. So I think there are lots of suggestions that people have given around governmental schemes and so on that needs to be fixed, supply chain recommendations and so on. I'll stick to broadly information asymmetry as a theme, to be honest. One is, I think, more work around how do you get accesses to registration, how do you get accesses to documentation at two levels is really important. One level of workers to be able to access benefits for people eventually if they come out for work, who are working and employed in the MSME space. Similarly for business owners and enterprise owners who run these enterprises, just I think support around getting them formally registered, getting documentations made, just finding out what those schemes and accesses to support will look like, I think would be really, really crucially important. And I think a larger body sort of taking the mantle on that would be incredibly helpful as one. I think two, we speak of collaboration all the time, but there isn't a better opportunity that's presented itself. And just working on figuring what those essential pivots for some of the larger MSMEs could look like, I think would be really helpful. So just what those demand requirements are, supply requirements are, and how people can pivot. I think just information being shared. If a larger organization does, I think a lot of the nonprofits, a lot of SHGs already have communication networks. So I think the idea should be that a body tries to collect this information and pass it on, and others then create networks to be able to reach the last mile. So I'd stick to information asymmetry as my recommendation of what needs to be done around entitlements and around business opportunities. I think financing is a larger question that I think many bodies, including the government, will have to come together to figure, both in terms of tiding over to be able to pay wages for workers, which has been a mandate that's come out, but has been very difficult to implement, but also just being able to sustain these enterprises so they survive.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Medha, for your time. I hope this sparks many more conversations and many more people come back to Pratham and I think seek collaboration, seek more conversations from you. Thanks for talking to us and thanks for your time.
Thank you. Lovely speaking to you guys as well. Thank you, Ashwin.